We all know that Call of Duty's anti-cheat situation is pretty much in the mud right now. And as a high KD player, I regularly encounter cheaters in the game, so I decided to take action into my own hands and play PlayStation 5 Crossplay off. And in my head, I simply assumed that Crossplay off Warzone wasn't going to be particularly different from regular Warzone. And I was entirely wrong. Crossplay off Warzone is a dramatically different experience of Warzone, so much so that I felt like I was playing an alternative version of the game. And today I wanted to talk about what made it different and what made it unique, and also talk about some of my hardships of moving from a PC, because there are lots of things now that I'm recognizing for console players are actually major disadvantages. The footage in the background today is from a regular PC game, but there are lots of libraries of footage on the live section which will have tons of hours of console crossplay off live stream footage if you're interested in seeing it. Before I talk about why PlayStation crossplay off plays radically differently, I want to talk about some of the things that I struggled with as a PC player. Now, I make no disguise of the fact that as a PC player, I have phenomenal hardware and every possible advantage in my favor. I have well-balanced audio, I have the lowest latency input monitor at an OLED with 0.03 milliseconds, I have a 4090, a 3900K, I'm pushing 240 frames of 1440p, so pretty much any other system is going to be a step back. And I make no mistake about that, I don't hide that. It is a reality that better hardware does give you competitive advantages. But I think the things I struggled with in terms of playing on PlayStation and crossplay off wasn't necessarily the limits of the power of the hardware, but rather just how it works. So the first one's a great example. It's clarity. I'm going to have a lot of people in the comment section telling me that the PlayStation 5 looks fine and that it's my settings or I'm doing something wrong or that I've got motion blur on or something. And none of that's the case. I am a giga sweat, I know what I'm doing, and I'm playing on an OLED monitor, so visual fidelity is something that I'm obviously very privy with. But the console version of Warzone is blurry. And I think it's not actually the performance of the game itself, or any of the settings that are available to you, but rather all of the extra visual faff that you can disable on PC, the ambient occlusion, the weird types of anti-aliasing they tried to do, increasing the shadows unnecessarily high. Things like those make the game visually more blurry and also give you less performance. And this was genuinely one of the biggest struggles for me. A couple of really obvious examples are when you look through windows in Warzone on PC, it's really easy to see somebody through a window, and it's really easy to see somebody in the water. But because the settings are cranked really high, graphically, for whatever reason on PlayStation 5, it is less easy to see those targets, and it's a very strange decision. Although the graphics, generally speaking, are quote-unquote nicer, they are, clarity-wise, substantially worse, and I would liken it to having a layer of Vaseline over the top of your display, or not taking the film off of your TV. It's genuinely that much of a difference. And this kind of ties in with another problem, is general performance. Now, I am very sensitive to frame rates of video games, and I know when a frame rate is chugging, and that was definitely the case over on PlayStation 5. And I think some of this is actually down to Urzikstan having a few bugs with FPS drops, both on PC and on console, some of which hopefully have been resolved recently. But there were a couple of places where I was easily dropping into like the 50s and 60s, as opposed to being at the 120, which is where you want to be for competitive formats. So the console generally struggled performance-wise, and I think that's partially down to the game code itself and partially down to the fact that the PlayStation 5 isn't necessarily the most powerful machine in the world, but also just the visual clarity. And ironically, both of these would be solved by simply having a competitive graphics option, because the graphics settings would be lower, meaning you'd get higher performance and more frame rate, and you would also see more. So it would be great to see console players get that option, because right now, they're at a disadvantage for no reason. And the other thing was input lag, and this is something that happens both on Xbox and on PlayStation because they don't really prioritize it, but input lag is a big deal. On PC, I play with pretty much zero input lag. I don't use a capture card on my dual PC setup, so I don't get any input lag there. I have a very fast response rate monitor at 0.03 milliseconds, so I don't get any input lag there, and I've overclocked my controller to increase the polling rate to make it more responsive. For context, the polling rate is how much your device communicates with your system. On PC, my PlayStation 5 controller's polling rate is 8,000. The highest it goes on console over Bluetooth is 800, which is 10 times less. And as much as I got used to it, between the lack of visual clarity and the very obvious input delay, the game just doesn't feel anywhere near as responsive on console, and those were things that I just had to get used to. Ultimately, everybody's playing with the same setups and mostly the same hardware, so it was kind of the same for everybody. So let's talk about why the gameplay is so different. Now, it's worth underpinning this entire conversation with that anybody who has disabled crossplay on PlayStation 5 has done so because they've made a conscious decision to go into the menus and turn it off themselves. And that's because they've obviously encountered cheaters, or because they've obviously encountered clips online of cheaters and decided that they'd rather have a cleaner gameplay experience. Now, if you're in any highly populated region like America or Europe, you will pretty much get full crossplay off lobbies from about midday 2 p.m. onwards. Anytime in obscure hours or early in the morning, you probably won't, but for the most part, the player base is high enough that you won't struggle finding a lobby. That's just how many people have turned it off. So for the most part, you can assume that these are players who are well tuned in and well dialed in with conversations around Warzone because they're aware of the cheating situation, or they're skilled enough that they've encountered cheaters fairly frequently and decided that that's not the experience for them. And I think this actually feeds into why the gameplay experience is so different. The first obvious thing I noticed is that players are a lot more passive in this mode. Even in trios and quads, especially in solos, people do not push each other nearly as much as you would anticipate they would, and it's a lot more slow. I would say teams tend to hold a little bit more and hope to get a down or a kill with a util or a flashbang or something of that demeanor before making any kind of play. And I would say just generally, people just were unwilling to make plays. I felt like I was the aggressor the vast majority of the time, which is normal for me because I'm a higher KD and I play the game pretty religiously. But I was noticing it more than usual. Even when I was solo against trios and solo against quads, I had a lot of teams just compacting into buildings and refusing to budge, which I guess to some extent is to be expected of people who have made decisions to quit crossplay. And obviously, if they're playing trios and quads with mates, all of their mates have also made that decision. So it's a coordinated setup, if you will. And I think that ties me into my second point. When I did play trios and quads, a lot of the teams I did run into were a little bit more coordinated than when crossplay was on. Now, it's hard to say why exactly that is. Matchmaking is a bit of a mystery when it comes to Warzone. But I would assume that most people who are playing in groups with crossplay off have made a conscious decision to disable crossplay together as a group and often play together as a group. So teams were pushing me out more consistently as 3 stacks and 4 stacks, and teams generally were just playing a little bit more team play orientated than what I'm used to. I'm used to be able to getting 1 or 2 easy picks on opponents in squads because they're playing away from their squad, or they're a little bit separated, so on and so forth. But on crossplay off, that was definitely a little bit harder to achieve. And I think both the passiveness and the more coordination actually just comes from the overarching decision to disable crossplay. I think these are people who have encountered enough cheaters to genuinely be fed up of encountering them. And whether it's just because they're used to getting pushed by random people who 1v4 them or aimbot them out the sky, or if it's just because they're just weary of playing aggressively generally, there just seems to be a much slower paced Warzone experience to be had with crossplay off. My last point, though, is probably my biggest one. I think this is the one that I appreciate the most. It is a far more enjoyable experience to play crossplay off than it is to play crossplay on. And the reality is that every time I died, I could just appreciate the player and the play that they had made in front of me, rather than being concerned about them cheating. And if you watch my live streams, and if you don't, be sure to subscribe. We're live pretty much every single day at 9 o'clock in the morning in the UK. You will know that we encounter a high number of them. 4 or 5 a stream, often 1 or 2 every single game or every other game. It's an extremely common experience for us. And even more players we encounter who I personally don't say anything because I don't want to just be constantly complaining about potential cheaters. But, sometimes I'll get killed by a level 40 who to me looks highly suspicious and just ignore it for the sake of content and the sake of entertainment. And all of that goes out of the window when we're playing on console crossplay off. I could just appreciate somebody making a play on me, somebody gunning me, somebody doing better than me, regardless of their playstyle and if they're a bit more passive. It just takes that out. It takes that dynamic away from the game. And I enjoyed it so much more because of that, because I felt like I was able to appreciate the players who I was playing against more than what I do right now. Now, this is the part in the comment section where people say, no, cheats for console exist. They don't. It's a complete fabrication that console cheats exist. Console cheats primarily exist for people either jailbreaking their consoles, which instantly disables them from accessing official servers, or B, having a development kit, and development kits disable themselves if they aren't in verified ownership. The percentile of console cheaters is probably 0.000000000 to the power of 10 1%. So absolutely nothing. Like it is literally, there are so many zeros before that 0.1, it is obscene. So, you know, you're going to hear all these nonsense stories online about, oh, they're developing cheats for console, or they're accessing their RAM, bro, and it's just totally made up. They're all fabrications, and console off, especially on PlayStation 5, is pretty much the only way you can guarantee a clean experience. And I know some other people are going to say there are input devices like Cronus's and Zims, which, yes, of course, PlayStation has tried to tackle. I'm sure they will update their devices and try and work around it. And I'm sure there'll be lots of back and forth between game anti-cheat, consoles, and trying to disable that. But quite frankly, I don't really care if I run into those guys. You know, those guys don't bother me. You know, yes, it is cheating. Yes, they might not have recoil. But the reality is I am far more concerned about the players spin bot aimbotting me versus Timmy, who spent 70, 80 quid on a device so he can try and shoot straighter. Overarchingly, though, I think console crossplay off or PlayStation 5 crossplay off is the way to go. If you're somebody who only plays in the evenings and you're somebody who only really plays, you know, with friends in the afternoon on PlayStation, then I think the reality is there's no reason not to. You will still get full lobbies, and it just guarantees a clean experience for you, which is why PlayStation mandatorily requires all games to come with crossplay off variants. They require it because they don't want people to have a worse experience on PlayStation 5 if crossplay is permanently enabled. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts and feelings down below if you're somebody who is a crossplay off gamer. What's your experience been on PlayStation 5? And obviously, for those of you on Xbox, crossplay off isn't really a reality without breaking into a bunch of settings and really just not finding any players. But is it something that appeals to you? As always, folks, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.